The evening sky hung heavy with the anticipation of rain. A soft drizzle began to coat the streets, leaving glistening trails on the cobblestone path outside the hotel's entrance. The world outside was a haze, a blur of fading streetlights and fleeting shadows. Inside the hotel lobby, it was warm, inviting, perfectly contained, almost too quiet for a bustling city. Clara stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a rag. She had been working the night shift again, and the usual ebb and flow of tired travelers checking in or checking out filled the space. She had learned to appreciate the peace of her role, the anonymity it offered. No one ever asked her anything beyond the essentials: directions, room numbers, late-night coffee. That suited her just fine. But tonight, something was different. It started as a soft shuffle against the door. Clara barely looked up, assuming it was just another delivery or a staff member coming in from the back. But when the bell above the door jingled, she instinctively glanced up. The sight that met her eyes made her freeze. A small, ragged puppy, barely more than a bundle of fur, stepped cautiously into the lobby. Her thin legs wobbled under her as she tried to steady herself, her fur matted and dirty, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. Clara's heart skipped a beat. No collar, no leash, no owner in sight. The puppy limped across the polished floor, her steps hesitant, as though she had never walked on anything this solid before. Clara's gaze followed the little creature as she moved slowly towards the front desk, completely unaware of the looks she was attracting from the few guests who were still awake. Clara wasn't sure why, but something inside her made her step forward. It wasn't a decision, it was instinct. There was a pull in the air that told her this wasn't just another stray dog. This was something that needed her help. Something was drawing her to the puppy like a magnetic force, like she was meant to be there for that exact moment. The puppy reached the counter and paused. Her little nose twitched as if she were trying to make sense of the strange place she'd found herself in. And then, without hesitation, the puppy climbed up onto one of the chairs near the counter and curled into a tight ball. Her tiny body shook uncontrollably, as if the world had finally worn her down. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She knew that look. She had seen it in the eyes of too many people who had walked through this hotel, people who had lost something. Whether it was hope, warmth, or simply their sense of security, it didn't matter. Clara had seen the same helplessness in their eyes. And now, here was this little puppy, looking at her with those same pleading eyes. Without thinking, Clara moved towards the small creature. Her movements were slow, calculated, as though she didn't want to startle her. The puppy lifted her head just a fraction, locking eyes with Clara. For a long, drawn-out moment, nothing moved except for the slight tremor in the puppy's body. Clara crouched down, her fingers extending toward the puppy. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but her hand was steady. She wasn't sure what she expected from this moment. Maybe a growl, maybe a frightened yelp, or maybe even a retreat. But what happened next caught her completely off guard. The puppy took a cautious step forward, her small paws clicking on the floor. Clara's breath hitched, and in a soft whisper of a voice, she spoke. "Hey there, you're safe now?" And just like that, as if the puppy understood her words, she walked closer, hesitantly, but trusting, and gently pressed her head into Clara's open hand. Clara's eyes widened. It was as if the puppy had recognized the kindness in her. In that moment, everything else faded into the background. The hotel, the guests, the late-night hustle. None of it mattered anymore. The only thing that existed was the small life in her hands. The puppy, trembling from fear and exhaustion, allowed Clara to lift her into her arms. The warmth of her tiny body sent a wave of comfort through Clara's chest, a sensation she hadn't felt in so long. It wasn't just the puppy who needed help. It was Clara, too. She hadn't realized how much she longed to be needed, how much she had craved a connection. For the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel invisible. She felt like she mattered. As she cradled the puppy close to her chest, Clara walked over to the back room, her heart overflowing with a sense of duty she couldn't explain. She gently placed the puppy down on a blanket by the small heater in the staff area, her hands still trembling as she watched the little creature try to settle. What would happen to this puppy? How had she ended up here, so far from safety? And why had she come to this hotel, of all places? But Clara knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let her go. Not tonight. Not ever. Clara's life had always been a collection of quiet routines, moments that blurred together without ever making a sound. The hotel where she worked felt like a sanctuary from the chaos of the world. A space where she could lose herself, where she wasn't expected to be anything more than a background figure, blending in among the other hotel staff. She never minded. In fact, she welcomed the anonymity. People didn't linger here. Guests checked in, stayed for a day or two, and then moved on. There was no need to make any deep connections. She arrived early, as usual, taking her time to prepare the small cafe corner in the hotel lobby. A pot of coffee brewed, the scent filling the air, a faint touch of sugar and cream always waiting for guests. It was a simple life. She did her job with precision, never straying from the routine. The hotel guests rarely noticed her presence unless they needed something. There were no meaningful conversations, no real bonds formed. For Clara, this was just how she liked it. Her colleagues often spoke about their plans for the future, the vacations they wanted to take, the families they wanted to build. Clara didn't share their optimism. She had long given up on dreaming of a bigger life. Her past had been filled with missed opportunities and quiet regrets, leaving her content in the background, where she could exist without too much pressure. She lived in a small, modest apartment a few blocks from the hotel. The building was old, with peeling paint and creaky floors. Her neighbors were distant, as if they shared a silent agreement not to interact. Her mother, who lived in a different city, would occasionally call, asking if she was happy, but the conversation would quickly dissolve into polite pleasantries. Clara would lie and say everything was fine, even though she knew that something inside of her was missing. It wasn't a miserable existence. It was just ordinary, and Clara had learned to be okay with that. Then one evening, everything changed. Clara had just finished wiping down the counter, preparing for the end of her shift when she heard the faint sound of the hotel door opening. The familiar chime echoed in the otherwise silent lobby. She didn't expect anyone at this hour. Just the usual few late check-ins and guests coming back from dinner. But this time, the sound of the door wasn't followed by the usual chatter or footsteps. Instead, there was something else, a soft shuffle of feet, a quiet rustling that didn't seem to belong in a place like this. It didn't take long for Clara to realize that it wasn't just any guest stepping inside. A small, bedraggled creature appeared at the entrance of the hotel. A puppy. Clara froze for a moment, unsure if she was seeing things. The puppy was a tiny, pitiful thing barely more than a few months old. Her fur was matted and dirty, streaked with mud and dust. The small creature seemed disoriented, blinking her wide, brown eyes at the unfamiliar surroundings. She took tentative steps forward, her little paws making soft clicking sounds on the hotel's cold floor. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something far worse. Clara's heart began to race. She knew this wasn't a simple case of a lost dog. The puppy's frail frame, the way she moved so cautiously, all of it spoke of fear, of abandonment. Clara's eyes followed the puppy as she slowly crept further into the lobby, pausing every few steps to look around as though hoping for some sign of safety. Clara had seen many things in her life, but nothing quite like this. The puppy, small and vulnerable, seemed to be searching for something, someone. It was as if she had wandered into the hotel from some other world, one that had left her behind. The loneliness in her eyes was almost unbearable. Clara couldn't explain it, but she felt an overwhelming need to help, to do something. The puppy's tiny body shivered, her fur a patchwork of knots and dirt. She was thin, too thin, her ribs clearly visible beneath the mess of fur. Her eyes darted from side to side, panic setting in as she looked for any kind of reassurance. Clara stood rooted to the spot for a long moment. She had never been an impulsive person, never one to jump into situations without thinking them through. She had spent her life avoiding the kind of emotional entanglements that would make her vulnerable. But in that instant, looking into the puppy's desperate eyes, Clara knew she couldn't just ignore her. Without thinking, Clara moved toward the small creature. Her footsteps were careful and quiet, trying not to startle the puppy, whose anxiety was palpable. Clara crouched down to the puppy's level, slowly extending a hand toward her. The puppy hesitated for a moment, her tiny body frozen in fear. Then, as if guided by some silent trust, the puppy took a step forward, her little nose brushing Clara's outstretched fingers. It was a simple, fragile moment, but Clara felt her heart swell. It was as if, in that instant, the puppy was not just asking for help. She was asking for something more, something that Clara herself had long been searching for: connection. Clara gently scooped the puppy up, cradling her in her arms as though she were a fragile treasure. The warmth of the small body against her chest sent a rush of emotion through her, emotions she hadn't felt in years. Her heart, which had long been closed off, began to open, piece by piece, as she held the trembling creature close. As she stood there, holding the puppy in her arms, Clara felt an unfamiliar sense of urgency. She knew she couldn't just leave this tiny soul alone to fend for herself. What if she had been abandoned? What if she had been running for days, alone in the streets, cold and hungry? Clara couldn't stand the thought of it. With the puppy's tiny body nestled against her, Clara made a decision. She would not let her stay in the hotel lobby. She would take her home. Clara's footsteps echoed softly through the quiet hallway as she made her way out of the hotel's back entrance, still cradling the trembling puppy in her arms. The world outside was damp and cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the hotel lobby. It was late in the evening, and the streets were empty, save for the occasional car passing by. Clara didn't notice any of it, her attention consumed entirely by the small, fragile creature that had changed the course of her life in just a few brief moments. The puppy's tiny body shivered against her, and Clara instinctively pulled her closer, offering what little warmth she could. Her chest tightened as she thought about the state the puppy had been in. Abandoned? Lost? Either way, the puppy had wandered into her life, and now Clara felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She turned a corner, heading toward her apartment building just a few blocks away. It was the same building she'd lived in for years, small, old, and crumbling in places. The elevator was broken, so she climbed the stairs slowly, careful not to disturb the puppy. With each step, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Her life had always been quiet, almost passive, but with this puppy in her arms, she felt as if the world was suddenly alive, buzzing with possibility. Clara reached her door, fumbling for the keys. She unlocked it quickly and pushed the door open, holding it wide enough for the puppy to step inside. She felt an odd sense of relief as the warmth of the apartment wrapped around them both. The scent of familiar things, old books, worn furniture, and a faint hint of lavender from the candles she kept on the windowsill, filled the air. For a moment, everything felt normal again. But nothing was the same anymore. This small, trembling puppy was part of her world now. Clara lowered the puppy gently onto the rug by the door, watching as the little creature looked around with wide eyes. The puppy's fur was dirty and matted, clinging to her thin frame. She was far too thin for such a young dog, and her ribs pressed painfully against her skin. The small, frightened creature seemed so out of place in Clara's cozy apartment. Yet there was an undeniable connection. Clara's heart swelled with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. She had always been the type to keep to herself, to hide behind her routine, but this little life, this tiny soul, was different. Clara hurried to the kitchen, pulling open the cupboard in search of something she could give the puppy. Her hands moved quickly, gathering a small bowl of water and the last remnants of canned food she had. It wasn't much, but she couldn't stand the thought of the puppy being hungry or thirsty after what she had been through. When she returned to the living room, the puppy was sniffing around cautiously, taking tentative steps on the rug. Her eyes darted from corner to corner, as if she didn't quite know what to make of the space she had entered. "Hey, little one," Clara murmured softly, crouching down beside the puppy. The puppy hesitated for a moment before inching closer, her nose twitching in the air as she took in the scent of the food. Clara smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay. You're safe now." The puppy slowly approached the bowl, her tiny body trembling as she lowered her head to drink. Clara watched, her heart aching at how desperately the puppy seemed to need nourishment. As the little one ate, Clara took a seat nearby, just watching, letting her presence be a quiet reassurance. She had been through so much, this puppy. Whatever had happened to her before Clara found her, the trauma of it all was still evident in her fearful eyes. Clara could see it, even in the way the puppy moved, cautiously, always scanning her surroundings for danger. The bond that was forming between them was undeniable, a quiet understanding that neither of them had expected. This was more than just saving a lost dog. It was about something deeper, something that Clara couldn't quite put into words yet. The puppy needed her, but Clara also realized that, in some inexplicable way, she needed this puppy just as much. As the puppy finished eating, she moved toward the small bed Clara had placed in the corner. With a soft whine, she curled into a ball, her small body still trembling slightly. Clara stood up, moving quietly toward the bathroom to grab a towel. She returned and gently began to wipe the puppy's fur, careful not to hurt her. She worked slowly, tenderly, trying to remove the dirt and grime that had built up over what could have been days or even weeks. It wasn't easy. The puppy flinched every now and then, her nerves still on edge, but Clara persisted, knowing that each brush of the towel was a step toward healing. As Clara worked, her mind raced with questions. Where had this puppy come from? Who had left her alone in the world? She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random encounter. There was something about this puppy's arrival that felt like a sign, something bigger than either of them. The thought of it made Clara pause for a moment, wondering how her quiet, solitary life had suddenly turned into something filled with so much uncertainty. She finished drying the puppy's fur, and for a moment, the little creature just lay there, breathing softly, her tiny body still. Clara gently stroked her head, marveling at how small and fragile she was. She had no idea what the future would hold for them, but in this moment, she realized that it didn't matter. The uncertainty didn't seem so frightening anymore. In fact, for the first time in a long time, Clara felt a sense of clarity. She had spent so much of her life hiding behind walls, emotional walls she had built for protection. But here, now, with this tiny life in front of her, she understood something. The walls were no longer necessary. Clara stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. The lights from the street lamps flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the pavement. The world outside felt distant, almost unreachable, but inside her apartment, it was just the two of them. The puppy had given her something she hadn't realized she'd been missing, a reason to care, a reason to open up. It was no longer just about surviving day to day. Now Clara had something, someone to protect, someone to love. She turned back to the puppy, who was now resting peacefully, her body curled up on the soft bed. Clara smiled, a quiet, contented smile. She couldn't explain it, but in this small, fragile creature, she saw a future. A future she hadn't dared to imagine before. There was so much unknown ahead of them, so much that could go wrong. But Clara knew that whatever came next, she would face it with this little life by her side. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel alone. The days that followed were a blur of emotions for Clara. What had started as an unexpected encounter, a stray puppy wandering into the hotel, quickly transformed into a challenge neither of them had anticipated. Luna, as Clara had named the puppy, was gradually starting to trust her. But the road ahead was long and filled with obstacles that neither of them were fully prepared for. At first, the changes seemed subtle. Luna's fur, once matted and rough, started to soften under Clara's care. The puppy's tiny frame, which had been so thin and fragile, began to show the first signs of strength, as her ribs were no longer as visible. Her eyes, which had once been wide with fear, slowly began to relax, taking on a curious, yet cautious look. Clara had taken Luna to the vet, where the doctor assured her that, although the puppy was malnourished, she was otherwise healthy and would make a full recovery with proper care. Still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something deep inside Luna had been broken. The little puppy was healing physically, but emotionally, the scars of her past were still fresh, and Clara didn't know how to fix that. The first few nights were the hardest. Clara had always been a light sleeper, But the presence of Luna beside her in the bed made it almost impossible to sleep at all. The puppy would whimper softly in the middle of the night, her body still trembling as if she were haunted by nightmares. At first, Clara would try to comfort her, petting her gently, whispering soft words of reassurance. But it seemed like nothing could ease Luna's distress. Clara would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what horrors the puppy had faced in her short life. She tried to imagine the streets that Luna had roamed, the days she had spent searching for food and shelter. The fear in her eyes told a story Clara could never fully understand. But the nights weren't the only struggles they faced. The days were filled with their own set of challenges. Luna had grown accustomed to the quiet comfort of the apartment, but there were moments when the world outside felt too overwhelming for her. Clara would take Luna on small walks around the block, but the puppy was easily startled by any loud noise. The sight of a passing car, a person walking too quickly, even the simple sound of a bird flying by, would send her running back to Clara, trembling in fear. Every new sound seemed to take Luna back to a place of panic, as if the outside world was still a threat. Despite this, Clara didn't give up. She knew that patience and time were the only things that could heal Luna's fear. But deep down, Clara also began to feel a growing sense of helplessness. She didn't know how to fix the invisible wounds Luna carried with her. And in a strange way, it made Clara feel the same. She had spent so many years hiding from her own feelings, building walls around her heart to keep herself safe from the world. But now, holding this small puppy, Clara felt those same walls crumbling. She didn't know how to open up, to trust again, but Luna was teaching her that it was possible. Yet that didn't make it any easier. One afternoon, as Clara returned home from work, she found Luna sitting by the door, waiting for her, her eyes full of longing. Clara bent down, scratching behind the puppy's ears, but Luna didn't jump up as she usually did. Instead, she just sat there, staring at Clara with a look that was almost too intelligent for a dog so young. There was something in the air, something Clara couldn't quite place. Luna had always been a little skittish, but today, her behavior seemed different. Clara glanced around the room, looking for anything that might explain the change, but the apartment was quiet. It wasn't until later that night, as Clara was cleaning up after dinner, that she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound at the window. Luna had heard it too. The puppy's ears perked up and her body froze. Clara felt a wave of unease wash over her, but she tried to stay calm. She set down the dish she was washing and walked toward the window. She hesitated, wondering if she should even open it. But the scratching continued, and there was no mistaking it. It was coming from outside. With her heart racing, Clara pushed the curtains aside and peered out into the dimly lit street. She could see nothing but shadows and the faint glow of streetlights. But the sound of scratching continued, persistent and unnerving. She opened the window just enough to stick her head out, scanning the street below. That's when she saw him. A man was standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadows. He was staring at Clara's apartment, his face hidden in the dark, but his posture was unmistakable. He was waiting for something or someone. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Luna, who had been quiet up until this point, began to bark. It was a low, anxious growl at first, but it quickly escalated into frantic barking. Clara immediately closed the window, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man, and why was he watching them? Luna's behavior only worsened after that night. She became more jumpy, more nervous, and Clara knew that something had triggered her fear. But what? The days that followed were filled with restlessness. Clara kept the curtains closed, always keeping an eye on the street below, but the man never returned. Luna would refuse to leave the apartment, even when Clara tried to coax her out for a walk. It was as if the outside world had become an enemy once more, and Luna wasn't the only one feeling it. Clara herself started to feel a nagging sense of paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustling sound outside the apartment seemed to set her nerves on edge. She couldn't help but feel that Luna's fears were her own, that they were bound together in some inexplicable way. The emotional toll of caring for Luna was starting to weigh heavily on Clara. There were days when she questioned whether she was strong enough to help the puppy, whether she was even equipped to handle the mounting tension in her own heart. She had never considered herself particularly brave or resilient. But now, more than ever, she was being forced to confront her own vulnerabilities. Yet, despite everything, Clara refused to give up. She knew that if she let Luna down now, she would be breaking the trust the puppy had placed in her. So she took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and kept moving forward. She would keep going for Luna and for herself. The road ahead was uncertain, and the obstacles were many, but Clara had come to realize that this was a fight she couldn't afford to lose. Clara's life had become an unspoken rhythm, a pattern of taking small steps forward only to be jolted back with the next challenge. The uncertainty that had followed Luna's arrival was quickly becoming the new normal. Each morning, Clara woke to the same anxiety, the same quiet fear that had taken root inside her. What if she wasn't enough for Luna? What if she couldn't fix the damage that had been done? Luna's fear continued to grow, and with it, Clara's own. She began to notice the puppy flinching at the slightest sound. An overturned cup on the table, the creak of the wooden floorboards beneath Clara's feet, the whir of the refrigerator's motor. At first, Clara had chalked it up to the trauma the puppy had experienced before coming into her life. But as time passed, it became clear that Luna's anxieties weren't going away. They were multiplying. The worst of it came one fateful morning when Clara had opened the door to leave for work. Luna, who had grown accustomed to following her everywhere, was nowhere to be found. The silence in the apartment, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive. Clara called out to Luna, her voice trembling with rising panic. She searched the rooms, her eyes scanning every corner, but the little puppy was gone. Her heart raced as she rushed to the front door, certain that Luna had slipped outside while Clara had been distracted. But there was no sign of the puppy in the hallway. Clara's chest tightened as she ran down the stairs, calling out Luna's name. The few neighbors who were awake stared at her with puzzled expressions as she dashed past, not stopping to explain herself. She needed to find the puppy. She had to. 1,000 thoughts spun in her mind. What if Luna had run out into the street? What if something happened to her? Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. The city outside was alive, bustling with the usual morning rush. Cars honked, people hurried past, but Clara's world felt eerily still. She stepped out onto the sidewalk, scanning the area with frantic eyes. She called Luna's name again, louder this time, her voice breaking with the weight of the fear that had built up inside her. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, there was a small sound behind her. Clara whipped around, her breath catching in her throat, and there, standing in the shadows of the building's corner, was Luna. The puppy was trembling, her body low to the ground as she looked up at Clara with wide, fearful eyes. For a brief moment, Clara could only stand there, frozen, as her heart swelled with both relief and sorrow. She had never been so relieved to see Luna, but the sight of the puppy, so small and vulnerable in the wide open space, made her feel the full weight of their shared struggle. "Luna," Clara whispered, her voice breaking as she took a cautious step forward. The puppy didn't move, only stared at her with an expression that was almost pleading. The gap between them felt enormous, as if some invisible force was keeping them apart. Luna, it seemed, was still trapped in the fear of her past. She didn't know how to trust the world around her. Not yet. Not fully. Clara extended her hand, her voice soft, full of reassurance. "It's okay, Luna. I'm here. You're safe. Come back to me." For what felt like an eternity, Luna remained motionless. Then, slowly, cautiously, she began to inch toward Clara. Each step was hesitant and uncertain. Clara didn't move, allowing the puppy to come to her on her own terms. She didn't want to push Luna. She wanted to prove to her that this was a safe place, a safe world. When Luna finally reached her, Clara knelt down and scooped her up gently. The puppy immediately curled into her chest, trembling as if the world were still too big and too frightening. Clara's heart ached for her, and she held Luna close, whispering soothing words in her ear. "I won't leave you. I promise. I'm not going anywhere." The walk back to the apartment was quiet. Clara didn't hurry, knowing that rushing would only make things worse for Luna. She could feel the weight of the puppy's small body in her arms, and every step she took felt like a quiet affirmation of her commitment. The world outside might have been chaotic and loud, but in this moment, with Luna safely in her arms, Clara felt the peace she had been longing for. That night, Luna slept soundly, curled up against Clara's side. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara was able to sleep as well. There were no restless nights filled with Luna's soft whimpering, no moments of tension as they both feared the world outside. For a fleeting moment, Clara allowed herself to believe that they were okay. But deep down, she knew the road ahead would not be so easy. Luna's healing was only just beginning, and Clara had to be prepared for the long journey that lay ahead. It was clear that Luna wasn't just dealing with physical trauma. Her mind, her spirit, had been scarred in ways Clara couldn't fully understand. Each day would be another step in the healing process, and it would take more than just time. It would take patience, compassion, and trust, the very things that Clara had spent years denying herself. As the days passed, Clara couldn't help but feel the undeniable pull to become the person Luna needed, the person she had once been too afraid to be. In the weeks that followed, Clara found herself more and more immersed in Luna's world. The fear that had once seemed like a barrier between them began to fade, replaced by a quiet but undeniable bond. Every step Luna took toward recovery was mirrored by Clara's own emotional journey. It was as if they were healing together, each of them pushing past their own fears and insecurities. Luna learned to trust Clara, and Clara, in turn, learned to trust herself. It was a slow, sometimes painful process, but with each passing day, the walls between them crumbled a little more. And through it all, Clara never gave up. There were moments when the struggle seemed too much to bear, when it felt like they were both stuck in a never-ending cycle of fear and uncertainty. But Clara pressed on because she knew that, just like Luna, she had the strength to overcome whatever came next. In the quiet moments, as they lay together on the couch or sat by the window watching the world go by, Clara realized that their connection was something far deeper than she had ever anticipated. Luna had come into her life for a reason, and together, they were going to face whatever challenges came their way. One day at a time, days turned into weeks, and each passing moment felt heavier than the last. Clara could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Luna had become more than just a puppy in need of care. She had become Clara's reason to keep going. Every morning, every night, it was the little puppy's presence that pushed Clara to continue, even when she felt as though the weight of the world was too much to bear. The challenges of the world outside seemed far less threatening compared to the small, constant battle they fought together inside their apartment. But as the weeks wore on, their bond deepened. And with it came new, unforeseen challenges. The vulnerability Clara had felt when Luna first arrived had transformed into something different, something more intense. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown anymore. It was the responsibility of protecting this fragile life that was now entirely dependent on Clara's decisions, her actions. It was a cold afternoon in early winter when the first real crisis struck. Clara had been working from home, glancing up from her laptop only to see Luna's body stiffen. The puppy was sitting by the window, her ears perked up, her body taut with tension. Clara knew Luna's behavior by now. She could tell when something was off. At first, she thought it was just another passing moment of anxiety. But the look in Luna's eyes told Clara otherwise. Something was wrong. Clara stood and approached the puppy cautiously, bending down to her level. "Luna," she whispered softly, her voice laced with concern. The puppy remained motionless, her eyes locked on the street below. Clara's gaze followed Luna's, but she saw nothing out of the ordinary. It was just another quiet afternoon in the city, except for the fact that Luna's behavior was anything but normal. Her fur was bristled, her mouth slightly open as if preparing to bark. There was a low growl rumbling in her throat, a sound that Clara had never heard from her before. And then she saw him. The same man who had been lurking outside the building a few weeks ago, the man who had been watching their apartment, was back. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she saw him standing in the shadows across the street, just as he had done before. His face was obscured, but there was no mistaking him. It was the same person, the same unsettling presence that had haunted Luna's every move since the first time she'd seen him. And now, it seemed he had returned. The man was standing completely still, as if waiting for something or someone. Clara couldn't be sure, but her instinct screamed at her that he was up to something. She immediately shut the blinds, but not before she noticed Luna's frantic response. The puppy's eyes were wide with terror now, her body trembling, as if she were on the verge of collapsing. Clara's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the walls closing in on her, the familiar feeling of anxiety creeping in from the edges of her mind. Why was this man here? What did he want with them? Was he stalking them? Was Luna the reason he kept returning? Without thinking, Clara grabbed her phone and dialed the police. She could barely keep her hands steady as she spoke, her voice shaking as she explained the situation. There's a man outside my apartment. He's been here before, watching us. I don't know what he wants, but my puppy is terrified, and I'm scared too. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, professional, but Clara couldn't focus on the words. The only thing that mattered was keeping Luna safe. Every instinct in her told her to leave, to get out of the apartment, and take Luna somewhere, anywhere, away from this man. But the thought of running, of leaving everything behind, terrified her. The minutes that passed felt like hours. Clara paced the room, her eyes constantly flicking to the window, to the door, to Luna, who was now lying on the floor, too scared to move. The silence between them was palpable, and Clara could feel the fear in the room. It was as if Luna's anxiety had spread to her, wrapping itself around her heart, making it harder to breathe. Finally, the sound of sirens echoed down the street, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was like a lifeline being thrown her way, a sign that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. But even as the sirens grew louder, Clara knew this was far from over. The police arrived within minutes, their car pulling up to the building's entrance. Clara rushed down to meet them, her heart still racing as she led them into the apartment. The officers immediately began to take control of the situation, asking her questions, assessing the situation, trying to understand what had been happening. Clara explained everything as best as she could, but words felt inadequate. She didn't know what this man wanted or why he was targeting them, and she couldn't shake the feeling that he would never leave them alone. After a tense few minutes, the officers decided to go outside and confront the man. They spoke to him briefly, but the exchange didn't last long. When they returned to Clara's apartment, their faces were hard to read. "We've checked him out," one of the officers said. "His name is Ben. He doesn't have any criminal history, but we'll be keeping an eye on him." Clara nodded, but the relief she expected never came. The situation had been defused for now, but she knew it wasn't over. Something about this man, this situation, felt too unsettling to ignore. What if he came back? What if he wasn't done with them? As the officers left, Clara returned to the apartment, where Luna was waiting. The puppy was curled up in her bed, but her eyes were wide, still filled with fear. Clara sat down beside her, reaching out to gently stroke her fur. "It's okay, Luna. We're safe now. I promise." But even as Clara spoke the words, she couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her chest. She knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for survival, both Luna's and her own, was only getting started. The emotional toll of this fight was more than Clara had ever anticipated. The fear of not knowing what was next, the uncertainty of how to protect herself and Luna, felt like an endless battle. But there was one thing Clara knew for sure. She wasn't going to let anything happen to Luna. Not now. Not ever. The following days were a blur of heightened vigilance. Clara couldn't shake the unease that lingered in the air. Every sound seemed amplified. Every creak of the floorboard, every rustle of the blinds, heightened the anxiety she had carried for years but never fully acknowledged. The walls of their small apartment, once a comforting place of solitude, now felt like a prison. Every shadow felt threatening. Every unfamiliar noise set Luna's body trembling with fear. Though the police had promised to monitor the situation, Clara knew that protection didn't come in the form of a uniform or a badge. It came from within. It came from the courage to face the unknown, even when everything inside her screamed for her to run, to flee with Luna and never look back. Clara's fears weren't just rooted in the mystery surrounding the man who had been lurking outside. There were also the everyday struggles. The weather had turned harsh, the winds howling outside the windows, bringing with them an icy chill that seeped into the apartment, no matter how tightly she closed the windows. The temperature dropped faster than Clara could keep up with, and despite the thick layers of clothing she donned, the biting cold never truly left. The heating system, already old and worn, struggled to keep up with the demands of the bitter winter. The nights seemed impossibly long as Clara huddled beneath blankets with Luna, trying her best to stay warm while doing everything in her power to make sure her puppy felt safe. But the cold wasn't their only enemy. Hunger became a constant companion. Clara had always been careful with her finances, but the recent spike in rent and utilities had forced her to tighten her budget in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always prided herself on being resourceful, but now, with Luna's needs added to her own, she found herself stretching her resources thinner than ever before. The puppy needed proper nutrition to regain her strength, but Clara was forced to cut back on her own meals in order to make sure Luna had enough. There were days when Clara would eat nothing but a slice of bread, too exhausted and too afraid of running out of food to consider anything more substantial. Luna deserved better. Clara knew that much. With each passing day, Clara found herself grappling with feelings of guilt and inadequacy. How could she have let things get this far? How had her world fallen into such a state of chaos so quickly? She questioned herself, questioned her decisions, her ability to provide. The overwhelming sense of responsibility she had for Luna's well-being seemed to expand until it consumed every thought, every moment. But it wasn't just the material struggles that weighed on Clara. It was the emotional toll. Luna's fear was pervasive. The puppy was getting better, but she was still haunted by her past. Luna had come so far, yet she was still so fragile. Every new experience felt like a test for Luna, and Clara wasn't sure how much more the little puppy could handle. She would flinch at sudden movements, still trembling at loud noises, as if waiting for the next strike. There were times when Clara could barely sleep, her eyes trained on the small body curled up at her feet, just to make sure Luna was okay. But she also began to notice that Luna was beginning to watch Clara too, eyes wide, almost searching, as if unsure whether Clara, too, could be trusted. It was on a particularly bleak morning, one of the coldest they had endured, that Clara made a decision. The apartment, with its peeling walls and sagging floors, no longer felt like a place of refuge. It felt like a place on the edge of breaking, and Clara couldn't bear it anymore. Luna deserved better than this. They both deserved more than this. The small space they shared might have offered temporary comfort, but it was clear that they were both drowning in its limitations. Clara needed to find a way out, a way to rebuild, to heal, and to protect Luna from the world outside. With a heavy heart, Clara packed what little they had, Luna's belongings, a few of her own essentials, and a few things that reminded her of the better times. It was a painful decision, but she knew it was necessary. As she looked around the empty apartment, a wave of sadness hit her. It wasn't just the apartment they were leaving behind. It was the life they had tried to build there, the small moments of hope and trust that they had both clung to. She was leaving behind the place where they had fought for survival, a place that had been both their sanctuary and their prison. But there was no time to waste. The cold outside felt unforgiving, and the city seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Clara took a deep breath as she stepped out the door with Luna by her side. They were going to find something better, somewhere better. Clara didn't know where that would be yet, but she was determined to make it happen. They had made it this far, together, and she was not about to let that bond break now. The streets were quieter than usual, the wind carrying the promise of more snow. Luna walked at her side, her tiny body pressed close to Clara's leg for comfort and security. Every so often, Luna would stop and sniff the air, her head tilting as she seemed to sense something unknown in the world around her. Clara didn't mind. She didn't rush her. For the first time in a long time, the world outside felt manageable. It was still cold, still daunting, but they were facing it together. As they walked, Clara thought about their future. She had no idea where they were going, no idea what lay ahead, but she knew they couldn't go back. They couldn't stay in the apartment that had become a symbol of their struggles. This was a fight they were in together, and the only way out was forward. They found a small shelter later that day, a place that offered warmth, food, and a chance for Luna to relax and feel safe again. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a small beginning. Clara set down Luna's bed in the corner, watching the puppy curl up with a soft sigh. There was a moment of peace, an understanding that, for now, they were safe. And in that moment, Clara realized that the battle wasn't just about surviving the dangers that loomed outside. It was about finding hope, even in the smallest of moments. She had learned something she hadn't understood before, that survival wasn't just about fighting back. It was about holding on one step at a time and allowing yourself to feel the warmth of connection, no matter how fleeting it might seem. It wasn't over, and it never would be. But for now, Clara had Luna, and Luna had her. The shelter wasn't supposed to be their permanent home. It was just a temporary stop, a brief respite from the chaos of the outside world, a place to rest, to breathe, and to plan their next move. But as the days stretched into weeks, Clara began to feel the weight of their situation settle in her bones. The shelter was kind, and the people there were good-hearted, but it wasn't home. It was just another stop in their journey, another place to wait. And waiting was something Clara had grown tired of. Every day, she woke up early to check the help-wanted ads, searching for a job that would provide enough to get them back on their feet. Every night, she made sure Luna was fed, wrapped in the warmth of the only comfort they had left, the small, makeshift bed that Clara had placed beside her own. Luna had become a constant source of solace, her presence a reminder that they had made it this far together, that they could make it through whatever was to come. But it wasn't enough. Clara knew it, and deep down, she could see that Luna knew it too. The puppy had become more withdrawn over the past week, quieter than usual. Her playful energy had been replaced by an unsettling stillness. Clara watched as Luna curled up in her bed, her eyes unfocused, as if she were searching for something beyond the walls of the shelter, beyond Clara's gaze. Clara tried everything she could think of. She played with Luna, took her on walks through the small yard, and tried to fill their days with love and care. But there was a shift, something Clara couldn't explain, something that tugged at her heart in a way she couldn't ignore. It was on a cold afternoon, when the first signs of snow began to fall, that the moment came. Clara was sitting at the small wooden table in the corner of the shelter, her eyes glued to the job listings on her phone, her mind racing. She hadn't found anything yet, nothing that would pay enough, nothing that would guarantee their safety. It was frustrating. It felt like a never-ending cycle of uncertainty. She glanced over at Luna, who was lying on the floor, her small body curled tightly in on itself. The puppy had barely moved all day. Clara stood up and walked over to her, kneeling down to stroke Luna's fur. But when her hand touched the puppy's back, Luna didn't respond. Her body was stiff, her breathing shallow. The sight made Clara's heart drop into her stomach. "Luna," Clara whispered, her voice thick with concern. Luna barely lifted her head, her eyes dull, as if she didn't have the energy to even acknowledge Clara. Something was terribly wrong. Clara's pulse quickened. She crouched down beside Luna, gently trying to coax her to sit up. "Luna, baby, what's going on?" But Luna didn't respond. The small body remained limp in Clara's arms, no sign of the playful puppy she had once known. Panic surged within Clara. She had seen Luna go through so much in the past few weeks, had watched her overcome so many challenges. But this was different. Something was wrong, and Clara didn't know how to fix it. Her hands trembled as she scooped Luna into her arms, carrying the limp puppy toward the shelter's small medical area. Her heart raced in her chest, her mind spinning with fear. Was Luna sick? Had the cold weather finally taken its toll? Was this the end? Clara's breath hitched in her throat as she realized the terrifying truth. She had no idea how to save her. The shelter worker, a woman named Sarah, immediately noticed the panic in Clara's eyes. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to Clara's side. "I don't know," Clara said, her voice breaking. "She won't move. She won't wake up. She's not responding to me. I don't know what to do." Sarah immediately began to examine Luna, her hands gentle but firm as she checked the puppy's vitals. Clara stood frozen, her eyes never leaving the small, fragile form of the puppy in Sarah's arms. It felt as though time had stopped. All of Clara's hopes, all of her plans, everything she had fought for, seemed to hang in the balance in this one moment. "Clara," Sarah said softly, her tone calm but serious. "Luna's vitals are weak. Her temperature is dangerously low. She's in shock. We need to get her to the vet as soon as possible." Clara felt a cold wave wash over her. Please tell me she's going to be okay." Sarah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she motioned for Clara to follow her, and the two of them rushed out into the snow-covered streets. Clara held Luna tightly, feeling the puppy's weak body against her chest as they made their way toward the nearest animal clinic. With every step, Clara's heart beat faster. The snow was falling heavier now, and the streets were almost completely silent. The cold cut through Clara's thin jacket, but she hardly noticed. All she could think about was Luna, the puppy who had been her light, her reason to keep going. The thought of losing her, of losing everything she had fought for, was unbearable. By the time they reached the clinic, Clara could barely breathe. She handed Luna over to the vet as they rushed her inside, the world around Clara blurring into a haze of panic and fear. The waiting room felt suffocating, the air thick with anticipation. It was as if the entire universe had narrowed down to this one moment, this one question: would Luna survive? Minutes passed, and each one felt like an eternity. Clara paced back and forth, her mind racing through all the possibilities. None of them good. She felt helpless. She felt powerless. And more than anything, she felt the crushing weight of fear for the first time in so long. And then the door opened. The vet stepped out, her face unreadable, and Clara's heart stopped in her chest. "Is she?" Clara couldn't finish the question. Her throat was tight, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's stable," the vet said, her tone a bit more reassuring now. "It was close, but we managed to warm her up. She had severe hypothermia and shock, but she's fighting." Clara's breath caught in her throat as relief washed over her. She didn't know what she had expected, what she had feared, but the words, "she's fighting," were all Clara needed to hear. Luna wasn't done yet. She wasn't giving up. Luna's recovery wasn't going to be easy, but it was possible. The battle wasn't over, and neither was Clara's fight for her puppy's future. Clara's relief was short-lived, but it was enough to carry them both through the darkest of hours. The vet's words echoed in her mind as she sat by Luna's side, watching her puppy breathe in slow, shallow rhythms. It was a long recovery process, one that would test Luna's resilience in ways neither of them had anticipated. But for Clara, this was the beginning of a new chapter. Luna was alive. She had fought her way back from the brink of death, and now they had a chance, a real chance, at a new life. The shelter had continued to support them during Luna's recovery. Sarah, who had become a comforting presence in their lives, had checked in on them every day. She encouraged Clara to rest, to take time for herself. But Clara could barely leave Luna's side. Each moment felt precious, and the thought of anything happening to the puppy again was unbearable. She had already lost too much. She couldn't bear the thought of losing Luna as well. During the next few weeks, Clara and Luna built a routine. Every morning, Clara would wake early to check on Luna, making sure she was stable and strong. She spent hours reading to her, talking to her, offering her all the warmth and comfort she had in her heart. And every time Luna responded, her tail wagging ever so slightly, her eyes brightening when Clara would gently stroke her fur, the bond between them grew even deeper. It wasn't easy. Luna was still weak. She couldn't go on long walks yet, and her energy levels were nowhere near what they had been before. But Luna was determined. Clara could see it in the small, steady way her puppy fought to regain her strength. Slowly but surely, Luna began to improve. Each day was a small victory, and Clara cherished those moments like precious gems. But Clara knew that they couldn't stay at the shelter forever. It wasn't the life she wanted for Luna. They needed stability. They needed a place where they could truly heal, not just physically, but emotionally. They needed a home. Clara began saving every penny she could, looking for job opportunities, even taking up work that felt beneath her qualifications, just to get enough money together for a new start. She found a small, affordable apartment on the edge of town, one that was within walking distance of a park where Luna could run and play once she regained her strength. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step towards something better. It was theirs. The move was both an exciting and bittersweet experience. Clara took great care in packing up their things, what little they had, her hands trembling as she carefully placed Luna's bed in the back of the car, her heart swelling with pride at how far they had come. It wasn't just the physical journey that had brought them here. It was the emotional one. The pain, the fear, the hope, and the unbreakable bond that had carried them through it all. When they arrived at their new apartment, Clara felt a wave of relief wash over her. The air was warmer, more welcoming. The space was small, but it felt like a sanctuary. She unpacked Luna's things first, setting up a little area by the window where the sunlight would shine in every morning. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Luna, still a bit weak, but slowly regaining her strength, explored their new home with cautious curiosity. Clara sat on the floor, watching her puppy sniff around, her tail wagging with tentative excitement. There was so much healing left to do, so many challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, Clara felt like they were on the right path. They had made it, together. In the weeks that followed, Luna's progress was nothing short of miraculous. She began to run again, albeit with a bit of hesitation, testing her limits. Her playful energy returned, and she would chase after the small toys Clara would toss across the living room. Clara couldn't help but laugh, her heart swelling with joy as she watched the puppy who had once been so frail now bounding around, full of life and spirit. As Luna grew stronger, Clara found herself growing stronger too. She had started working at a local cafe, her first real job in months. It wasn't glamorous and the pay was modest, but it was enough. She made new friends, and the sense of normalcy she had longed for began to take root in her life. Every evening after work, she would return to their apartment to find Luna waiting for her, wagging her tail in greeting, her eyes full of love and trust. They had their struggles, their ups and downs. There were still moments of uncertainty, moments where Clara would doubt whether she was doing enough, whether she was giving Luna everything she needed. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. Together, they were building something new, a life of stability, of love, of healing. One afternoon, about a month after they had moved in, Clara took Luna to the park. The sky was clear, and the air was crisp. The trees were beginning to bud, a sign that spring was just around the corner. Luna ran ahead, her little legs moving faster now, as though she had finally come into her own. Clara watched her, a smile on her face, feeling a deep sense of pride. It was in that moment, watching Luna race through the grass, that Clara realized how far they had come. They had fought through so much. The cold nights, the hunger, the fear, the uncertainty. And now they were here. Luna was safe. They were safe. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Clara had given everything she had to protect Luna. She had made countless sacrifices, faced down her own doubts and fears, and come out the other side stronger for it. She had built a life from the rubble of their past, a life filled with love, hope, and possibility. And in the process, she had learned that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about loving, about protecting, about never giving up. As Luna returned to her side, running toward her with the joy of a puppy who had rediscovered her freedom, Clara knelt down to scoop her up into her arms. The little puppy licked her face, her tail wagging uncontrollably, her eyes full of happiness. Clara hugged her tightly, tears welling up in her eyes. "We made it, Luna," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We made it together." In that moment, Clara understood the true meaning of resilience. It wasn't about how much you could endure. It was about how much love you could give, how much hope you could hold on to, even when the world seemed determined to take everything from you. Together, they had survived, and together, they would thrive. If you've been moved by Clara and Luna's journey, take a moment to reflect on the resilience, the bond, and the love that can carry us through even the darkest times. Stories like theirs remind us that, no matter the hardships, there's always hope, always a way forward. If you believe in the power of love and second chances, share this story with others who need a reminder of what's possible when we hold on to each other. Love is the greatest survival tool we have. Let's make sure we never stop fighting for it.